Hello and welcome to this episode of the English Verbs series. Today we're focusing on the verb prefer. So as always, we'll begin by looking at how we write this verb in its different forms. So we've got the infinitive to prefer, past tense and past participle are the same, preferred, and if you notice there we double the letter R when we're writing it down. There's no ing form on this slide. The reason being is that it's one of those verbs that native speakers really don't use in the ing. I mean, you can make that form, preferring, but we just don't use it in that way. It would sound to me very unusual if somebody asked me a question or made a sentence with this verb in the ing. It's just unnatural, so there's no point going there. Just remember, native speakers tend to not use it in the ing. And then third person, prefers. So that's how they look when we write them on paper. But to really dig down into the pronunciation of this verb, let's look at the script from the dictionary. So looking here at the script from the dictionary, there are a couple of really interesting things to notice. First of all, these forms all have the same first syllable. So we've got the consonant cluster of pr, followed by a short I. So they all begin with pr. Now the second syllable is the stressed syllable. You can see from that mark at the top in the middle before the F. That tells us the syllable afterwards is stressed. So I'll run through them and just listen to where you hear the stress falling and try and repeat what you hear. So, prefer, preferred, preferred, prefers. So hopefully you are stressing the second syllable there. Now let's pay a bit of close attention to the second syllable because there's some really interesting stuff happening here. So with prefer, we don't actually pronounce that little R when we say the word in isolation. So the is the vowel sound that this word ends with. It's written with an R, but when we say the word in isolation, we don't pronounce the R, prefer. And when I say we don't pronounce the R, what I'm talking about here is so we're working here with the Cambridge Dictionary script. So this is a standardized version of, let's call it British English. That's not a fair representation of the beautiful diversity of accents that exist in the UK. This is just a standardized version and it definitely doesn't represent every native speaker. So I want you to bear that in mind because you're going to hear plenty of people from the UK who would pronounce that R as a result of their local accent. So please bear that in mind. When we're thinking about this kind of standardized version though, the R would activate, it would become a linking R if the next word begins with a vowel sound. So for example, I'll give you a sentence such as, I'd prefer it if you don't smoke. Prefer it. It begins with a vowel, and so this little tiny linking R, prefer it, rit, it kind of pops up and attaches itself between the two words, prefer it. But if we say the word in isolation, we don't need to activate that R. So that's something to bear in mind. So prefer, prefer it. So looking at the past simple and the past participle then, we've got this d ending. Now, when we've written this word, we've added an extra R and then an ED. But as you've probably, if you've watched any of my other videos, you've probably heard me say many times, there's no ed. We don't say prefer red, for example. That's not what you're aiming for. If you look at the script, it's preferred. So we've got that long vowel followed by a d. And the reason it's a d is because of the vowel sound. There are 3 different ways that you can pronounce those ed endings in English. None of them are ed. I'll put a link in the notes below to some videos where you can learn more about that if you're interested. Basically, there are 3 endings, 3 ways we can say the ED, and it really depends on the sounds that are next door to each other as to which ending we choose. There are rules that you can learn, and actually, given that English pronunciation is a little bit strange sometimes, it's lovely when you can find a rule to learn that is really concrete, and the ED endings are one of those rules in English, one of the few solid pronunciation rules we have, so they're definitely worth learning. So if you check out the notes, you'll find a link to that. So repeat after me nice and loud. Preferred. Good. And then the third person, prefers, with a Z. So we write it as an S, but we pronounce it as a Z, prefers, and it's because of that vowel that comes beforehand. Because if you think about it, basically when we make that we're vibrating the throat. And so it's just natural for that vibration to continue over to the next sound, and that's why it's prefers and not prefers, because that takes more effort to try and turn it into an S. So it's easier for your throat to just continue that vibration, and that's why it's actually a Z sound. Again, this is a pronunciation rule that's quite solid in English, so you'll find a link below to take you to a little collection of videos that I've made that tells you categorically how to deal with the third person S pronunciation. There's a couple of rules to learn, and once you've learnt them, you can apply them across the language. It's great. So check that out. So what we're going to do then is we're going to run through a few slides with example sentences to think about using this verb in context. So number 1, I tried both wines but preferred the red. We know it's the past. We tried them in the past. I preferred the red, so it's just simple. There's nothing too complex happening in that sentence. We preferred the first one. So again, it's in the past. There's no special thing happening with the tenses. It's just something that's finished. Thinking about a past participle form then, I would have preferred it if you had called first. This sentence is a bit more complicated. We've got a modal verb, would, so then we've got a have and preferred, so that we know we're talking perfective here. So I would have preferred it in the past if you had called first, so if before that you had called. So we've actually got 2 events in the past. There's you calling and then me having a preference. So this is quite a tricky sentence. That's the reason, not wanting to digress into grammar too much here, but that's the reason why a native speaker would choose past perfect if you had called, because there's 2 things and I'm putting them in an order. I've heard some really interesting explanations from students as to why they think we use past perfect, but sometimes people have misunderstood this. So if you're not feeling very clear, it's probably worth going to a grammar book to check it out. What we're doing is we're talking about 2 events in the past and we're making it clear to you which one happened first. So number 2 then, he'd have preferred it if you hadn't mentioned his ex-wife. So the he'd is a contracted form of he would, so it's similar to the first sentence. He'd have preferred it if you hadn't mentioned his ex-wife. So again, we've got 2 events. The mentioning the ex-wife happened first, and then we've got the consequence, him not being very happy about it. So he would have preferred it if you hadn't said anything. Okay, so again, if you're not clear with the tenses, don't worry too much, but it's probably worth visiting a grammar book for a review. So then we've got that third person. She prefers older men. Now this is third person in the present, so like I prefer, you prefer, he or she prefers. So we're talking about her general preference here, meaning that generally speaking, She likes to date older men, for example, or she finds them more attractive. He prefers oat milk in his coffee. Again, we're talking about general preference. It's just that he likes oat milk more than other types of milk, generally speaking. Okay, so we've covered our bases. Remember, we're not going to focus on the ing because you probably don't want to use that form. That's something that would signal you out probably as a second language user. So that's just something to bear in mind. So just to review what the forms look like on paper then, we've got our prefer, preferred, preferred, prefers. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Check out the playlist for other verbs to work with. I'm throwing one of these out there every so often, just so that we can eventually have a nice collection for you to work through. Working with verb tenses, I think some people find it incredibly boring. I know it's something I struggle with when I'm learning other languages, is remembering the different forms. But it can be really, really useful to do this from time to time, just to slowly build up your knowledge of the different forms to help you to use the language more accurately and also more creatively, I think. Anyway, thanks for watching and have a lovely day.